Here's how to pre-flight a Piper Cherokee 140 like this one.
One important distinction to make about low-wing aircraft is where we need to step here. So marked in black tape right here, these are the acceptable step regions. One important thing I will note, we don't want any more than one person on the wing at a time, and that's just so we don't accidentally damage the skin of the wing itself. So what we normally do is we'll grab the wing right here, put my foot here, and we don't want to step on the flap, even though that does have black tape. We don't want to step there because this is a moving component of the aircraft. So lift my foot up right here, and I'm up on the wing. Next thing we do, we're gonna go ahead and unlock the aircraft. Now there is a top latch up here on this airplane, so we wanna pull that, pull the door latch like so, and swing the door open. Right here what we have is a little solution. This is how we lock our controls together, so gusts of wind essentially aren't gonna be blowing our ailerons or elevators around, and this is just to prevent any damage to the control system. So, unlock that.
And now I can step on the wing because Jackson is no longer putting his weight on it. I should also add that even though the POH says you can step on the flap, yes, you shouldn't, but if you choose to, make sure the flap is fully retracted. You can absolutely not step on the flap when it is extended in any way. It comes out of its lock that makes it able to take weight.
So one thing I'm gonna do here, yes, I have the airplane keys here. We are not going to be sticking these in the switch until we are actually ready to start the airplane. So one thing I like to do is I'll stick it right here on this carb heat knob. That way I can look, I can see mags are off, I can walk around the airplane safely. The next thing I'm going to be doing, grabbing my dispatch sheet. Now this dispatch sheet, I'm going to be checking my Hobbs and tack time. Now we bill off of the tack time as explained on our website. I'm just making sure things are accurate for our maintenance spreadsheet. So we can make sure that we're billing the customer right and our records are correct for maintenance records.
If you don't check this properly, you might end up paying for someone else's hours. Don't do that.
Things are accurate here. That looks good. We got 5129.8, 5129.2.
It's about to tick over to the 8.
And our rule is to use the higher number.
Yes, so if it's between the 7 and the 8 like that, go ahead and go with the 8. Just another quick thing to check when you're getting your Hobbs and tack times. Make sure your mixture is full lean all the way back. Throttle is closed all the way back. Magnetos are off. Very important before you start your pre-flight inspection. Jackson's also going to open that window so we get some more airflow and start cooling this plane down. It's plenty hot.
We'll go ahead and rotate this knob. Now, this is a little different from the Cessna. We use our little knob right here, and it opens a flap on the outside, so that's going to get a little bit of air moving once we actually get the aircraft moving. Switch our master on over here. This is over on the left seat with the red switch. We're going to go ahead and flip that on, and we'll go ahead and switch all of our lights on as well. It's going to stay in that position. Yep.
And no need to turn on the fuel pump. Let's also flip on the pitot heat. It hides under there.
Well. It hides under this little charging unit, so we'll switch that on.
And we don't want to run this for too long because we could run out of battery. So we only leave the pitot heat on for a few seconds, and that should be plenty to get it warm enough.
All right, so up here, this is our rotating beacon, which in this case, most aircraft is red. This one, it's not red. But the fact is that it's there and it's working, it's in the correct position. This is one of our kind of position indicating lights right there. That one's also white. This one we kind of have tied in with our ADS-B beacon. So you want to make sure you leave that switch on all the time during flight because a lot of different airspaces actually require ADS-B. So we want to make sure that's on when we're flying in those airspaces. These are our nav lights. They're a lot like a boat where your left side is red, your right side is green. This is our stall warning horn right here. It's a mechanical device and it's going to activate a little red light in the cockpit. We're going to show you what that looks like here.
We don't have a horn on this aircraft. It's an older one. Light is fully acceptable on an older airplane like this one. If you see the red light on the dashboard, stop doing what you're doing. Maybe push that nose down and get some airflow over those wings.
Not meaning to turn the red light on. Landing light. So this is going to be used if you're trying to be seen by other people. And for example, if you're taking off, landing, any of those things, it's a lot easier to see the aircraft with this bright light on. So you want to make sure you use it at the appropriate times. One distinction I will make also is this aircraft does not have the strobe lights like some aircraft on the wingtips. So that's another thing you'll see on newer aircraft, newer Cessnas. Just some aircraft are different.
As you're stepping back into the plane after doing your electrical walk around, just make sure those fuel gauges are working and reading accurately.
Master switch off.
That way we don't drain our battery too quickly.
Another thing we want to do here with our pre-flight and our cockpit portion, we want to check our aircraft documents. And you can see right here on our dispatch sheet, we have our little checklist right there. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to look for our airworthiness certificate. So that's going to be back in this little pouch back here. They're both paper clipped together. They're kind of old and fragile, but we just need to know that they're there. So I'm going to pull these out for demonstration purposes.
I wouldn't pull it out every time. Do it with your instructor once or twice.
This is a very old document. We want to verify the tail number here, November 86028. So this matches the aircraft that we are flying. And the other thing we'll note, this is going to be more discussed during training. There is no expiration date on this as long as the maintenance requirements are complied with. The next one we're going to look at right here, this is our registration. So we want to verify, obviously, our tail number for November 86028, and then our expiration date, which is October 31st of 2030. So we are good on both of those. The next thing we're going to look at now is our POH.
Pilot Operating Handbook.
So one important distinction, POH versus PIM. POH is serial number specific, PIM is a general reference. So some people use those terms interchangeably, which is why I wanted to make that difference known. So right here, this is our, looks like an old weight and balance. Nope. I remember it's hidden somewhere. It's in this folder, isn't it?
A thing we should probably talk about, these older airplanes, they start to accumulate a lot of different documents.
Yeah.
So that would be the document, the addition for our radio there. So that document is Pilot's Operating Handbook Supplement. So that supplement needs to be in the aircraft as well. And here's our POH, and we can see that it is serial number specific.
So the other thing we want to check with our documents as well is our weight and balance sheet. Some aircraft, it'll be located in with the POH. This aircraft, it's in this lovely yellow folder that looks considerably old. But you just want to check the date, and you want to make sure this is the current one. So 4th January 2008, this is the one that's current in our maintenance spreadsheet, and you want to make sure it's with the aircraft. It has to be present in the aircraft to fly.
Yes, so that is the legally required. Is it legally required to calculate a weight and balance?
Technically speaking, you don't have to calculate one. It's generally accepted as a very, very good idea too, however.
And there's also a law that says the pilot in command must be familiar with all available information concerning the flight. Mm-hmm. And I think calculating weight and balance might be considered part of all available information to
Now,
me.
it's one thing if you fly the same plane every day and do the exact same thing, but it's still, I would personally calculate weight and balance every single day.
On our dispatch sheet, we have a spot where you can calculate your weight and balance, and should calculate it, both zero fuel weight and full fuel, or whatever fuel we're starting with, and our performance. And you'll learn with your instructor how to do this, but that's what that looks like. So we have both the aircraft's empty weight and balance, and we also have weight and balance calculated for this particular flight. The legally required one is the empty weight one. That must be in the aircraft at all times, but that one is highly recommended.
Another thing I will add as well, one more thing on here that we didn't cover, radio station license. This is only required if you're doing international flights. I don't think we're going to be doing international flights in this airplane.
I'm not planning on it.
It's just an important thing to note that some aircraft will need this because they will do international flights.
So we got weight and balance, we got airworthiness and registration, which I put back in there very carefully. Please don't handle those every time. Do it with your instructor because they are fragile. And then just check that they're there. Make sure you can see a little bit of both, but be very careful with them because they will degrade over time the more they're handled.
And there's no reason these two documents should ever leave the aircraft under any circumstances.
So now that we've confirmed documents and everything, we need to make sure the aircraft is mechanically ready for this flight. So while I'm in here, after I've turned off the electrical system and I've checked all my documents, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to grab our flap lever here. If you have electric flaps, you would want to extend those while the master is on. The Piper Cherokee has mechanical flaps, so we don't have to do that. We just pull this bar, there's 10 degrees, 25, 40. So now the flaps are fully extended, and we'll want them in that position so we can check them during our pre-flight. Now I have to figure out how to maneuver my way around this bar. I normally do it from the right seat. And as we climb out, be very careful not to step on that flap, because you really cannot step on it when it's extended. And we're going to start our pre-flight right here at this corner. So what I like to do is reach under the flap and gently pull a little bit, put some weight on it. Make sure that there's a little bit of play, but not too much. This is almost the exact amount of play you want to see. Check that this linkage is not too loose. This is correct. If it was looser than this, I'd be concerned, but this is exactly what I'm wanting to see. We'll go ahead and slide down. I'm looking in here. This is our aft wing spar attachment point. I want to make sure none of these rivets are loose because that's part of what's keeping our wing from twisting. The main wing spar takes the loads, but this takes the twisting, so I want to make sure that's good. If those rivets are loose, that's a problem. The way you can check for loose rivets is by tapping on the plane and listening. Notice how it's all ringing as one piece of metal. That's good. If you hear a clicking sound almost, I can't find any examples because this plane's maintained too well, but if you can find a clicking sound, that's bad. But if you hear a nice full ring that doesn't sound hollow, that's good. There are no loose rivets there. Now we're going to grab the aileron and very gently pull it up. Now we're going to check our hinge, and then we're going to come underneath. If you duck down under this, the aileron is up, it gives you room. We can check our linkage, and while you've got your fingers up in here, be aware that if the wind blew, that could slice my fingers off. So hold it with your other hand as you check the linkage. You don't want to just reach up in there without holding that aileron up, just in case a gust of wind comes.
I could say personally, I learned that the hard way as a student pilot.
Oh, you lost a finger?
No, I still got all 10. But
not ideal. And then also while we're here, we can look down at our flap linkages. We can look down the whole length of the wing and see all those flap linkages as we move it, the flap. And all of them have their bolts. They're all taking the weight. There's no obvious loose connections there. Moving on down, we have another hinge on the aileron out here. And we'll check that, make sure it's cotter pins. See how they bent the hinge pin so it doesn't escape? We want to make sure that bend is still there, otherwise we could have a problem.
And generally check all of our fasteners as well and just see that everything's tight, there's no loose fasteners.
You can see there's this bar thing that's hooked in. There's actually a big weight in here that helps make the controls easier to move. That's called a balance weight. And we want to make sure that that's still there. Otherwise the controls won't respond the way that they're supposed to. And we could get into a flutter situation as well, which would be very bad. We're also going to check this fiberglass wingtip. Don't put a lot of pressure on this because it's aerodynamic, not structural. There's some cracking of the paint, but nothing too serious. Oh, hear that? That's a loose fastener right there. So we'll have that tightened.
Now, one more thing we want to look for here is if we do see any cracks that are structural to this component, we want to see and make sure that they've been what's called stop drilled, and that's just stopping the crack from spreading, essentially.
There's an example of a stop drill right here. Notice this crack in the plexiglass was stop drilled. That's what that would look like. It prevents the crack from spreading. Moving on down, we're checking the wing leading edge, that there's not too much damage here. This is where a lot of sand hits, so eventually this can get sand blasted and you could have damage. Right now, this is looking really good. Don't trip over the rope as you do. See how that could be a problem. So step over the rope. And this is a great time to go ahead and untie said rope. So we'll just reach around there, untie this rope. And while you're doing it, it's a very good time to check your fuel tank vent. Please, if you get nothing else from this video, remember, check your fuel tank vents. If you have an issue there, you will interrupt the flow of fuel to the engine. Wasps, like mud daubers, love these little holes. Just make sure that nothing has tried to make a home in there that would block the flow of air into that tank. As the fuel drains from your tank, air has to go in to replace that volume, otherwise fuel stops flowing. Once we've checked the fuel tank vent, we can move on to the tire. We're going to check that there's good inflation, not too flat on the bottom, good tread, so there's good grooves here. None of the threads are showing. And you want to check around the whole tire, and we can't see the bottom of the tire, so it's good to pull the plane forward once you've untied it all the way and check your tires again so you can see the spot that the ground is blocking from view. Continuing on around, we have our brake rotor and the calipers that grab it. So we want to, if you get up above it, you can look down and see if you've got enough of that brake pad left. And I can see we've got plenty of brake pad there. We also want to check for extension on this strut. Typically 4 fingers is what you look for. I've got 3.5, so that's pretty close.
And you also want to make sure there's no leaking oil from the strut as well.
Yes, if you see a big puddle of fluid here, that's bad. While we're under here as well, we can see our battery drains are still open. So if that battery tried to vent some fluids or something, those can come out. We've got our marker beacon antenna. We can check that. And I can also see our transponder antenna way back there, that little straight one. We'll look at it as we come around to the tail. Now I typically like to do my fluids on a separate pass, so we'll come back and check our fuel, oil, all that. But what we can do now is we can go ahead and open this cowling. Now, it is very important that with the Piper Cherokee 140, at least, you hold this in as you do it. So turn this latch, gently let it out, but hold it in with this hand, because if you don't, it can spring back and hurt you. Another thing I would like to say while we're here, please notice, this is not what this little rotating thing is not what holds the cowling down. This is not correct. This will come open in flight. When you are latching these latches, it is very important that this little tip here locks under this mechanism up here. See that? All this quarter turn fastener does is prevent this from springing out. What takes the weight of the cowling is this little thing up here. So that's correct. It will latch like this, but that is not correct. That will break, that will come open in flight, and that would be bad. So please, 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 please make sure you get that underneath that little hook and then lock it down. All right, continuing on, we'll go ahead and open up the other one. Really hold it down with your other hand, because it will spring open to there very quickly. Now you can set it down back there. I don't like to, I like to hold it. We're just gonna check that there's no obvious problems in here. No obvious holes on the cylinders, no missing screws on our valve cover gaskets. Our spark plug wires aren't frayed or damaged, obviously. Our magnetos aren't missing a seal or something. These are all good things to see.
And generally looking for puddles of fluids as well is a good thing. We want to look down there.
All right, we're gonna just leave that unlatched like that because we're gonna come back around and check our oil. I'm gonna get down low. We're gonna check for our extension on our strut. There we go. I've got a little over 4 fingers, but we're still pretty close to the proper extension. Tread looks good. No obvious flat spots. I'm gonna leave the chocks on until we're ready to go. And I'm also gonna check our exhaust pipe. I don't see any potatoes shoved up in it, so that's good.
Or any type of cracks, anything like that.
Yeah, those would all be bad. Another thing you can do if the plane is cold is you can grab the exhaust pipe and just very gently move it. Do not be rough with it. But if you can move it and you hear a lot of clicking sounds with very gentle force, just like barely tapping it, that's a problem. You've got a shattered exhaust system and you probably don't want to go flying. Check that this big hole is not obstructed. This is where the air that enters the engine for cooling leaves the engine cowling and all that hot air can escape the plane. So we want to make sure that hole is open, not obstructed, because that's the exhaust part of our cooling system, not the exhaust pipe, but the exhaust of our cooling system is very important. The intake is, of course, these big holes on the front where the air goes in to cool the cylinders. We always want to treat this prop as hot. Assume the magnetos could fire at any time. Don't stand in the way of it, don't turn it. But check those prop leading edges. Make sure that there's no obvious sharp pits or something from like a rock strike. This has been blasted by sand, but there's no big divots, no sharp edges. That's good. Sharp edges can cause a focusing of fatigue and a crack can start spreading. So we want to make sure there's none of that. Another thing, just very gently making sure it can take some weight forward and backward. Not pulling hard, but just checking that there's no obvious damage there. Same thing with the spinner. We want to grab it on the front and just a very gentle move in a circular motion. I'm not using a lot of force. If there are cracks in this back plate on the spinner, you'll know when you do this, you'll hear loud popping sounds, it'll move, but notice that I'm not getting any movement from the spinner. And again, I'm doing this very gently. You don't have to put a lot of weight on it. I've seen people try to push a plane from the spinner. Do not do that. You will crack that backing plate, and that's expensive. Another thing we can check while we're here is our alternator belt. You can see that belt there. This belt is turned by the engine, and it drives the alternator pulley, and then it drives the alternator so we charge our battery. So if that belt is missing and not tight, we're gonna have some problems with our electrical system. Around our landing light, we can see this big opening, and you can barely see it, but there's a big filter in here. This is how our engine gets its air to breathe. So this is the air for the engine cooling. This is the air that is mixed with fuel that then gets burned. So we wanna make sure that filter is clean. If there's a lot of dirt and oil around this filter, it might not get proper airflow, and it's going to be time to replace that. We can also see our starter here. Not a whole lot to check on a pre-flight, because everything's kind of hidden with the starter. This is an oil cooler, just helps our engine stay even less hot. Oil is run through this, it's like a radiator for oil. Just want to make sure that there's not too much damage to these fins. There's obviously some from bug strikes over the years, but that's not too bad. All right, moving along, we can also check this side of the cowling. So we're gonna undo this latch, same way, very gentle. This latch, same way, very gentle, holding it down so it doesn't spring back. And we'll check for obvious holes in these cylinders, missing screws on our valve cover gaskets, our spark plug wires, some of our tubing that allows for airflow to other places. We can see our muffler, exhaust system pretty well. I don't see any obvious damage. Moving on around, we can check this wing now, and we're just kind of repeating the process now. Checking this wheel, flat spots, got a little bit of dry rot. I'm not concerned about it yet, but if that gets too much worse, it'll probably be time to replace that tire. I don't see any issues with our brake rotor. Brake discs look good, and we do have proper extension on our main strut like that, so that looks good. And our fuel tank vent, still clear. Please do not forget your fuel tank vents. We'll now undo this rope. And I like to coil it up just a little bit. Okay, moving on, we have this interesting structure. Now, it's still warm, and so we know that our pitot heat worked. And I would recommend checking this very soon after doing the electrical system check, because we didn't leave it on very long. Now that said, if you left the pitot heat on for a long time, I wouldn't recommend touching with the front of your hand, because if you get burned, you might burn yourself worse. Use the back of your hand, because if it burns you, you'll pull away rather than pull closer and get a worse injury. On the front, we have our hole for our pitot. This is the ram air hole. As air goes in here, it's going to turn the needle on our airspeed indicator. The faster we go, the more air that gets rammed in there, the higher the airspeed reading we get. This hole on the bottom is not the drain hole for the pitot tube. No, it's connected to this little tiny hole on the back, and that is our static port. This is how we get our altitude information, and it's also part of our our whole pitot-static system uses static pressure as well. Even our airspeed needs some static pressure to convert properly for the altitude. So check that all three of these holes are not blocked by wasps, putty, because sometimes when they do the inspection, mechanics will stuff putty in here, and I've seen it where they've forgotten to remove it. So make sure no putty is stuffed in those holes. Continuing along, this wingtip's still looking good. A little bit dirty. There's a few minor dents, but these are not to the point where I would be concerned for the structural integrity of the wing. Now, if these dents were larger, like someone had obviously hit a tree, please don't hit a tree with your wingtip. We would definitely need a mechanic to look at that, but these are acceptable. Continuing along, there's some cracks in the paint, but nothing too serious, no real damage to the fiberglass. Continuing on along, we'll move this aileron up, check its balance weight, check its hinges, and the retaining bend that they put on it. I'd call it a cotter pin, but it's not really a cotter pin. It's just a bend in the hinge pin. We'll come down here, we'll check this flap. Notice we're just doing what we just did, but in reverse. Checking all these linkages and connections. Checking this linkage. Not too loose. Wing root seal looks good. We can check our transponder antenna. That's going to be this one here. A lot of times it's like a shark fin type thing, but on these older planes, sometimes it's just a little tiny antenna that looks like that. We can check the top of our plane. We have our comm antennas, communications radios. Way up there, that antenna far at the front, that is an outside air temperature gauge. So that's how we know the temperature outside. This is an ADF antenna, automatic direction finder. It does actually work on this plane. It's very rare to find one these days that works. Problem is, the ground stations with which you would tune this to are even more rare, so it's kind of useless. We need to remove this because there's so few NDBs left, non-directional beacons. Now this antenna is flexible, and that's flexible so that it doesn't snap when you go through trees. This is your emergency locator transmitter antenna, and you want to make sure that it is there and not snapped off, because this is how people are going to find you if you mess up badly. Please don't mess up badly. Continuing along, we can check our vertical stabilizer. And please do not grab it here. That is not a structural part, that is aerodynamic. This is structural. But I do like to grab it and just gently move it forward and backward. Make sure that there's no obvious damage to the structure of this. And it's not bad to grab a wing from time to time. Grab it on the front and just check that that wing feels secure and that your suspension's working properly. But never do that here on the fiberglass. It's not meant for it. Do it on the structural part that can take it. And of course, still be gentle. Up top here, we can see these V-shaped antennas. This is our VOR system, VHF omnidirectional range. And we can use that for navigation, just navigation antennas. Here's our data plate. Want to make sure that this is visible and easy to see, and it gives us some information on the aircraft, such as the serial number, the model. Very important that that is displayed, and it's at the back of the plane because that's the part most likely to survive. So that way a plane crash is recognizable. Lovely. Now, the Piper has a unique characteristic, well, not super unique, but not as common, where the entire horizontal stabilizer moves for our pitch control. It's not like the Cessna over here, where it has a separate horizontal stabilizer and elevator. No, in the case of the Piper, the entire horizontal stabilizer is your elevator. So they mash the two words together. It's called a stabilator, which is really funny. Now, stabilators give you more pitch control, but they're more complex, so you really want to make sure that that bolt and that nut in there is in place and stiff. Another way we can check that is by grabbing the stabilator, and again, we want to be careful not to move it this way, but just getting some up and down motion. If you feel twisting in it, do not fly. Get that fixed. The bushings are wearing out, and you don't want those bushings to wear out, because if this comes off, that is unrecoverable. So make sure that it is very secure before you fly a Piper Cherokee. Moving on, we have our anti-servo tab. It's called an anti-servo tab because it makes the controls harder to move. Notice it has a 0 point, and then when it comes up out of that 0 point, the air coming over would get deflected up and push it back to its neutral point. So this anti-servo tab is actively attempting to zero the stabilator back out, and that makes the controls less sensitive. Without this, it would be very easy to get into a severe oscillation with your pitch control because it'd be too easy to pitch up and down. So it sounds weird to make the plane harder to fly, but no, that's exactly what you want. You want the controls to be harder to move because they're too easy to move with a stabilator. It's easy to give too much pitch input. Now checking our rudder. Don't move this much. Very gentle, just enough to move it like that, making sure that our hinges are working. I've seen people grab these rudders and slam them back and forth. Well, that's stretching your rudder cables because this directly connects to our nose wheel. Please don't try to turn your nose wheel by moving the rudder. That's just going to stretch your cables. You can hear those cables back in there. So those are very tight. We don't want to mess with them too much. Just enough to make sure that we have some movement. Now we're going to check our hinges on our rudder. Make sure that the nut is there, the bolt is there, and then there's another one down here that we can just see the bolt. And now that we're on this side of the stabilator, we can make sure that that nut is in place. I can see we have a missing screw here. If there were more of these missing, I would definitely call the mechanic, but the mechanics looked at this. This is fine. It will need to be replaced at some point. Now, what would be really bad is if this screw was still here, but loose, because notice that it could impede our elevator travel. Maybe this one not, but this one certainly could. If this screw were coming out, it could get caught as we move our stabilator, and that could make pitch control difficult. So that would be a serious problem, and we don't want that. Moving on along, checking all these hinges, checking for twisting here. It's good. It's not trying to twist at all. Oh, would you look at that? It looks like someone's tail struck this plane in the past. This comes out of the factory with a nice curve on it, but since it's flat, we know that's been dragged on a runway once or twice. Definitely not with us flying it, but probably a previous owner. Don't do that.
Before your fluids rock around, these are a few supplies you're probably going to need for this portion of the checklist. So you're going to want to see how much fuel you have. This is specific to the Cherokee 140. It's specific to each and every aircraft, so you want to make sure you have the right one because it'll show you these numbers are different for each airplane. You see the numbers right there, and that's just going to show you how much fuel is present in the tank at the time. The next thing you're going to want is this little sump cup right here. So they make different styles of them. They're really good for checking what kind of fuel you have, and it's got this white background so you can see if there's any water in the fuel, and we'll obviously discuss that when we get to that point as well. And if your aircraft is going to burn a little oil or something over time, you will want to carry a couple quarts of this stuff around, and we'll show how to add that as well as the paper funnel. So this is just so we don't make a mess under that nice, somewhat clean engine bay. The first thing we're going to check here is the level of fuel that's present in the tank. What we're going to do is we're just going to grab this fuel cover, and I'm going to set it down like this, and then we're going to take our little fuel straw. I'm going to put my finger over it. Make sure you have a firm grip on this thing. You do not want to let go of this. Let it into the fuel tank because it could cause some type of issues related to the fuel sending unit or potential fuel starvation, so you don't want that to happen. I've heard stories of people dropping flashlights in there, maintenance having to pump the whole tank out, so it's just something that we can avoid by being careful. But grab it, firm grip, put your finger over it, and then we are going to take it, stick it into the tank like so, keep my finger on it to keep that suction, and pull it out. Right there, you can see it's just below the 20 line, so we can tell it's got about 19 gallons on this side. So I'm going to let my finger go, and it's dropping the fuel back into the tank.
Now, one thing I will say that we have found with this particular fuel sampler, we get a more accurate reading if we do it on the outside. This tank has a slope, so we're going to go ahead and take our reading from out here, because that's going to give you the lowest number, and you'll see that we get closer to 18.5. And if you look in there, there's a little indicator. That's our tab. That is typically 17 usable gallons. This is calibrated, unfortunately, to unusable fuel. Be aware that there is 1 unusable gallon per tank. That's just how these older airplanes are, but be aware, yes, it says 25 gallons. You can only use 24 of that. The other 1 gallon is inaccessible, And it's not that you're not allowed to use it, it's that you physically cannot. So don't bank on that 1 extra gallon per tank, because you don't have it.
The other thing we're going to go ahead and check while we have this cap off is we're going to do a visual inspection of the fastening hardware and the gasket seal as well. We just want to make sure that it's there, there's no cracks or damage to it. This one looks perfectly fine. So see these little two...
Just maybe a little old on the seal. We'll get that replaced soon.
Yeah.
I know we've actually ordered that part, so it will get replaced soon.
The other thing too is when reinstalling this, there's these 2 little notches right there. So I'm going to line these notches up with those little grooves and then give it a nice twist. You don't want to make this too terribly tight, but you also don't want it coming off in flight. So right about there should be good for this.
I noticed that it's in line with the airflow. Not every airplane is, but most of them, it should be in line with the airflow like that. If you see it at an angle, that's probably bad.
Now this is not very easy on a low wing aircraft, but getting down here, this is our fuel sump right here. So what we're going to do is there's these 4 little grooves, but we want to line 2 of these little notches up with these little arms, and what that's going to allow us to do is we can lift and rotate 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Right about there is good. On this airplane it's a little strange, but we do have to kind of pull down on a little bit, just like so, to prevent it from leaking. That looks fine.
Yes, make sure that this thing is not dripping over time. Notice that there's no obvious drips coming down. If they do drip, just grab these little prongs and give it a little shake and pull down. Pulling down this way, and that can often lock them back into place if they have a drip problem. If it continues to drip, it might be time to replace that thing.
So coming up in the light here, we can go ahead and inspect our fuel sample, and we're just going to swish it around a little bit. If we did see water in this, we'd see it towards the bottom portion.
This plane has such clean fuel tanks that we're going to have to purposely add a contaminant so that you can see what it looks like. Not to the fuel tank, but to our sample.
We're going to contaminate our fuel here.
That's
for
just water.
Educational reasons, it's just water. Yep.
But we want you to see how water and fuel separate so that you know what to look for.
And this might happen after a really rainy night. Maybe the fuel tanks didn't seal properly. But you can see right there in the bottom how there's that lighter color. There's a separate layer. This is how we're going to know that there's signs of water in the tank. And at that point, you don't want to put this fuel back in because water is denser than fuel, and that could lead to potential fuel starvation issues, which is not good when you're flying an airplane in the air. The other thing we'll want to look for too is any large amounts of sediment. We can see there's a small bit of sediment in there. So there's a little filter in the top of this GATS jar. It's perfectly fine to dump this back in and use that filter.
Assuming we hadn't added the water.
Added the water, yes.
Because we did, we're going to have to dump this fuel into a collecting receptacle if that's the legal requirement in your state. It's not in South Carolina. It is legal to dump it on the ramp, but that's usually not advisable.
The other thing we're going to check here is we're going to check our oil. So this is part of our fluids walk around. We're going to open this up, and we did leave this open earlier, so you go ahead and use this little holder just to hold this open for me so I don't have to either hold it manually or rest it on the cowl. And one thing important about these, you don't want to over tighten them. You see, just about this is all you really need, because if it's tight, what happens is the materials expand and contract with heat cycles. It'll make it extremely hard to open this, so do not over tighten this under any circumstances. So we're gonna go ahead and pull this out, and you can see how that's just under the 6 line. It looks like we might need about 1/4 to 1/2 of a quart. So I'm gonna start with about 1/4 of a quart, and we'll see where that goes. So here's my little paper funnel, and we have these available in the office if there aren't any in the aircraft. Just like that.
And notice the dipstick is now holding the funnel. You don't have to figure out where to leave the dipstick, because if you put it on the ground, you can get dust and rocks into your oil system, which is bad.
Great.
So this oil is at 3/4 of a quart. So we're gonna add oil till we're at 1/2 a quart remaining. And we'll see if that gives us enough. And of course, oil being added is something that must be done by a private pilot or better, and it must be recorded in the maintenance records to be legal. We are both flight instructors, so it is perfectly legal for us to do this as long as the oil being added is recorded. And we do have a spot on your dispatch sheet for that.
So it looks like that is about half, or sorry, it's at about 1/2 right there. So that's the sufficient amount that we're looking for. And what we're gonna do here is we're checking our oil a lot like we check the oil in our car. So we're gonna go ahead and pull this dipstick out, wipe any oily residue off, and we'll stick it back in. I'm just gonna tighten it gently. Go ahead and remove it. And let's see where that puts us. Looks like we could use just a little bit more. That is just below the 6 line still.
So let's add 1 more 1/4 of a quart.
So at this point, now that we're done checking this side of the engine bay, we are going to go ahead and latch this cowl back down. So I'm going to go ahead and grab it. And if you decide to use this little thing, you just want to flip it back up there. And as I'm doing this, as we showed before, you want to make sure you use these locks correctly. So I'm going to go ahead and hold it with one hand, lock it under that groove, and then we're going to fasten the securing nut. This is a little bit hard to do with one hand, but you get used to it after a bit. Same thing on this side. Take this little tab, line it up with that hold, lock this retaining clip back down.
And notice that we can see those little tabs sticking out still. If you can't see the locking tab, you probably latched it wrong.
The other thing I'm going to do as well is just to verify we are about to go fly this, I'm just going to gentle taps just to make sure nothing comes loose. So we know this is locked, it's secure, and we are good to go.
While we're here, we can also check our windshield, which I forgot to do during my part. Make sure that's clean. Check these hinges, make sure nothing's escaping there.
Now coming up to this side of the engine bay as well, we're going to lift this cowl up, use our little... And on this side we have our brake fluid reservoir for a braking system. So as ridiculous as this may look, this was factory by Piper in the 1960s. It's just this silly little... And it has this fill line right here, so we're just going to pull this cap off. And you can't really see in there all that well, but you just want to make sure there's an appreciable amount of brake fluid available so your hydraulic brakes will work.
And if you use a flashlight, you can see it. It's just very difficult to catch on camera, but we can see that there's proper brake fluid in there once we get a flashlight on it. And then you would put the cap on like that.
Put it on, and you want to make sure it's tight, but not too tight. So right about there should be fine.
One other trick you can do, you can tap on it and listen. Hear the difference? So that's a way you can tell where the fluid level is.
One other thing we can do while we're on this side, you can actually see the oil filter. You can see it from the other side as well, but we can see on this side, it has the next due written on it, and we can just verify that with our dispatch sheet as well to make sure the oil changes have been performed as scheduled. So we'll go ahead and lock this cowl down as we did on the other side, again for demonstration purposes. And, oh, that's a friend. He's going into the airplane. Okay.
He is. Sometimes they like to try to make nests in there, so that could be bad.
And then rotate the retaining clip. Smack it just to gentle. It doesn't take much. So we're locked in, we're secured, we're good on this side. We'll go ahead and take our gas jar, and we're going to go ahead and check our fuel sump on this fuel strainer. This is part of our fuel system, and this is usually the lowest part in a lot of aircraft like the Cessna. So we'll go ahead and run that for a few seconds. And again, we just want to make sure this isn't dripping, which, oh, there, it's dripping a little bit, so I'm just going to wiggle the little grooves. And this is what a perfectly clean, good fuel sample should look like. As we said earlier, there's going to be a little bit of sediment, but we can filter that out with the top of our gas jar. So this is a good fuel sample, and because of that, we're going to go ahead and pour it right back into the wing. So coming down here to this side, we're under the left wing right now. We're going to take our gas jar and do the same thing we did with the other two strainers. And we're just going to sump this for a couple seconds and just check our fuel, make sure there's no water, large amounts of sediment, contaminants, anything like that.
There's a few contaminants in that one.
Contaminants in that one. But we'll go ahead and again, we're just going to wiggle this and make sure there's no drips coming down. This one looks good on this side. So I'm just going to swish it around just to see if we have any water, any large amounts of sediment. This one does have a little more sediment than the other side, so this one I probably would discard. If there was less sediment, no water, I would pour this right back into the wing though. So this one we're going to go ahead and discard in accordance with our local state guidelines. This flap handle right here in the 40-degree position, it's like the handbrake in a car. It makes it really, really hard to get in and out of the left side, so we're going to go ahead, I'm going to keep pressure on it. We're not going to let it drop, and I'm going to push the button. We'll slowly let it down like so. And right there, this is what our flaps are going to look like in the retracted position, so you can get in and out of the left seat a lot easier.
And that is our pre-flight inspection complete, but before you get in the plane and fly, remember your CCCP.
Ooh, communism.
No, not communism. Your cones, caps, chocks, props. So we're going to walk around here. This was something a very skilled pilot taught me, and I really liked it. Make sure your caps are secured. Make sure there are no tie downs. Chocks. Hey, look, some chocks. We're going to need to get those off if we want to go anywhere.
One thing we'll say is if they belong to the ramp you park your airplane at, do not put them anywhere near that prop. We'll usually put them back here so we can see them in the airplane and make sure they're clear of our propeller.
Speaking of that propeller, let's check that our propeller is clear. Sorry for the loud helicopter, but it is an airport. There's nothing in the way of the propeller. This cap is secure, and there are no traffic cones in sight. We'll complete our final walk around, making no other tie downs, nothing obviously in the way. Some people call this the final idiot's check. Make sure there's nothing obvious. Get the big picture. And it looks like this aircraft is good to fly. If you did your pre-flight inspection by memory like Jackson and I did, make sure you review the actual paper checklist and ensure that nothing was forgotten. So going through every item, not just checking it off, but actually verifying that you did it. And that way you ensure that nothing was missed. And once you get to this point here, you retract your flaps, passenger briefing. You'll do that once your passengers board the aircraft.